we are going to look at the serious economic meltdown and a crisis of sort that is facing Pakistan. Joined by Dr. Danish Khan. Dr. Danish Khan is a professor of economics and also a keen observer of what is happening in Pakistan. This current meltdown, how do you view it? I mean, many had anticipated that this would happen once the IMF conditions are accepted and implemented.
the uh, we have noticed in Pakistan that the state and elites in general are careful in terms of reforms in the realm of socio-cultural changes. Any economy or in any society, you need a minimal stability, right? And that stability is key for enforcing reforms as well.
Human Rights Watch, for example, yesterday made an extraordinary statement in asking the IMF to help Pakistan uphold right to electricity. And the HRW reiterated in its press release that, right to an adequate standard of living includes everyone's right without discrimination to sufficient, reliable, safe, clean, accessible, and affordable electricity.
It doesn't seem like the interim government is in any mood of defying IMF, right? So they are more interested in maybe negotiating terms with them.
Hello and welcome to New Wave Global. And today we are going to look at the serious economic meltdown and a crisis of sort that is facing Pakistan and its 250 million inhabitants. In particular, after signing an IMF agreement, Pakistan has had to adhere to certain conditions that the IMF generally imposes during structural adjustment or for stabilization reasons, which is withdrawal of subsidies from fuel and energy in particular, among other features. But this withdrawal of a subsidy on fuel, on electricity prices has led to a complete social chaos with unprecedented prices of petrol and diesel, and people burning their electricity bills, attacking the power distribution companies from the Azad Jammu Kashmir region to Karachi in the south of the country. And it is a crisis which has no end to it because the IMF conditions have to be met further as we go along. And it is a really, really difficult situation. But what it merits is a review on Pakistan's insistence or on seeking IMF assistance, which many hold is sort of unavoidable. But also, it calls into question as to why IMF programs lead to such social unrest and upheavals in developing countries like Pakistan. I'm joined by Dr. Danish Khan, whom I'm sure you have seen on this platform before. Dr. Danish Khan is a professor of economics and also a keen observer of what is happening in Pakistan and the rest of the world. So, Danish, welcome. And before further ado or delay, let's start talking about this current meltdown. How do you view it? I mean, many had anticipated that this would happen once the IMF conditions are accepted and implemented. But to see the scale of protests and upheaval is pretty, even I was surprised, Danish.
Yeah, no, you made an interesting remark, and it all started from Rawalakot in Pakistani-administered Jammu and Kashmir, and coincidentally I am from that place. So there has been a historical grievance at that place in terms of the electricity bills because the people feel that. They haven't got the good deal in terms of their resources have been used for the generation of electricity, but they have been paying high tariff rates and also not getting uninterrupted supply of power. So, but that led to a nationwide movement. And interestingly, I think the we have noticed in Pakistan that the state and elites in general are careful in terms of reforms in the realm of socio-cultural changes, right? Especially on the question of religion or culture. But they have been very insensitive or indifferent towards people's economic needs, right? And therefore, in any economy or in any society, you need a minimal stability, right? And that stability is key for enforcing reforms as well. It seems like the government has overplayed, and by government, it seems like all stakeholder, every party included, overplayed their hand and pushed average folks, especially working and middle classes, to a critical threshold. Now they have crossed that threshold, and people are now willing to take risk and go in streets. Um, and
Yeah.
it's also an interesting aspect, because historically we heard folks saying that in Pakistan people don't come around on issues of uh, economic justice, right? But here it's a consumption related issue, right? But people feel some sort of solidarity. Everybody can relate to each other in terms of, well, oh, you got such a high electricity bill and so forth. So it has created a solidarity movement as well, which is again something which was missing for a time.
Yes, Danish, that's a very good argument about around solidarity that you raised. But let me also add something that, Human Rights Watch, for example, yesterday made an extraordinary statement in asking the IMF to help Pakistan uphold right to electricity. So, as you know, Universal Declaration of Human Rights talks about standard of living, and the HRW reiterated in its press release that, right to an adequate standard of living includes everyone's right without discrimination to sufficient, reliable, safe, clean, accessible, and affordable electricity. Now, obviously, and they talked about putting into place a social protection plan universally, especially for the poor. But I mean, IMF argues that Pakistani state subsidizes electricity, and as we know, a good number of line losses occur. That
Mhm.
also, and there's electricity theft. Also, there's power distribution systems are defunct or in certain places dysfunctional. So, in the short term, what can this government do? I mean, can it just turn around and tell IMF we are not going to accept this and we're going to revive the subsidy? They would lose their IMF program.
Yeah, I mean, yes, they're kind of stuck in a rock and a hard place, right? So, and it doesn't seem like the interim government is in any mood of defying IMF, right? So they are more interested in maybe negotiating terms with them. So there's a broader critique on IMF framework and generally the neoliberal framework, where it is all about accounting, right? So economics is reduced to accounting exercise, that you want to just balance sheets and just add there and subtract there, instead of looking economics more as a long-term process, where at times you do have to bear losses, but they lead to long-term gains, right? So in that sense, but it's not on the cards right now for the Pakistani government if they have to stay within the realm of IMF program. Still, they can do some administrative measures. For instance, as you mentioned, ending line losses, which again, there are some more technical line losses, but also due to what they call governance failures in many ways, where the enforcement of uh, whatever, especially in terms of the recovering bills, and also some officer cadres, both within civil military bureaucracies, we heard, are not fully paying their bills, right? Or at least getting subsidies. So these, again, these might not be enough to offset that huge tariff, but can help at least the most marginalized segments of the society. So in other words, have to reallocate some resources and subsidize folks at the bottom, and especially the PSDP as well, the public sector development program. Maybe some funds can be rechanneled towards helping people in terms of those, especially who are the lower ends of the society.
Right, right. And Danish, this is obviously not unique to Pakistan. We have seen similar protests in Latin America, in Africa, in other parts of Asia. and the IMF seems kind of immune. I mean, after I teach a class in international development, and one of the weeks we devote to these programs. And the reality is that for 40 years or so, since the 80s, these structural adjustment programs, I mean, what is the problem there? Why can't they just learn from their experiences of handing down these sort of textbookish conditions from the neoliberal framework, of course, not realizing that how complicated these structures are? Because the IMF would never tell the government of Pakistan that, end all elite privileges,
Mm.
all the $17 billion of tax concessions and special rates. When it comes to elites and powerful circles, the IMF is kind of evasive. I mean, it just makes an odd comment or two, and then we pick it up and say, okay, IMF has also said that. But where do you think is the problem? I mean, we know the problem with Pakistan's governance, as you said, and
Mhm.
Pakistan's, the state capture by the elites. But the IMF also needs to introspect on that front. What do you say?
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, you made a good point, and then IMF gets a lot of heat. But in the case of Pakistan, I mean, it's a unique case in a way that governments do sign deals and then backtrack, right? And on a very short time horizon, which also complicates things. But as I said earlier, the overall framework is accounting framework for IMF, where they're interested in making sure that Pakistan does not default on its foreign liabilities, right? So if that's the sole goal, IMF is doing good policy recommendations because they want to make sure that the creditors, they do end up getting their money, right? So in that way, it's fine. But from the domestic political economy lens, it's the domestic policymakers who need to think beyond IMF and see reform in a more structural way. And by structure, I mean moving economy from low productivity to high productive sectors of the economy, and that require creating some new winners and some many big losers. And for instance, we need to move away from the real estate-led accumulation towards more sustainable development centered on maybe the industry, manufacturing, or services sector. So, and in that process, as you mentioned, the existing elites who are getting cheap rents, they will be heard, right? Therefore, it's a coordination failure at a broader scale. So, if you are an elected politician, you have a short policy horizon, right? You have short time horizon in the parliament or in the executive, and these reforms require massive support from the masses as well as from the other stakeholders, and which Pakistan has, and I think many governments have been lacking. And that's why that it creates more like a coordination failure. So in some ways, they're all can be blamed, and in other ways, none of them can be blamed because it's a structural issue. That's why we call it structural, because it's beyond one or two individuals' ability to manage this.
Exactly. Well put. I mean, about when, because this even structural reform has turned into such a cliche in our discourse. I mean, everybody talks about that. Everybody pays lip service. Be it the government, the military, the international lenders, and yet very little of that is on the horizon, or even likely to. And I'm really worried. Because I feel that these terms are appropriated, Danish, that structural reform from a capitalist neoliberal perspective would mean different from a progressive people centered version, right?
Mhm.
So privatization is now being argued as this panacea that you, and of course the state owned enterprises can't keep on making losses, but
Mhm.
I'm not so sure if privatization, just chalk block privatization, is the solution. But anyway, I don't want to digress now. Let us also examine the price of dollar in Pakistan has
Mhm.
also been rising. I mean, now in the open market, it has crossed 300 rupees level. I think it was selling for 330 rupees or so in the open market. And of course, one of the conditions of the IMF program is to bring the rate of dollar close to the to its market rate, based on the demand and supply and push and pull factors. Now that obviously has a direct bearing on inflation. So on
Mhm.
the one hand, electricity prices, which are going to fuel inflation, and then you have the price of dollar, which is also going to do that. So I mean, what do you see in the short term? Don't you think the inflation problem might become really unmanageable?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, these are all issues tied together. So because the previous government, the PDM government, was very aggressive on import contractions, right? And then through multiple administrative measures, for instance, not allowing LCs and so forth. So that reduced the demand of imports, which relieved some pressure on dollar, right? So that's why we felt. Now, since the new government, the caretaker government, has come up, and one of the requirements of IMF program is to not do import contraction, right? So therefore, now there are less restrictions on LC, which has led to uh, rupee depreciating, right? But that's the whole point, as you said, about this framework. And it might sound silly and ridiculous, but that's how it is. To be the It's not unintended consequence. The whole point of this policy is that rupee gets depreciated and things become more expensive, imports become more expensive, and therefore we assume that people will demand less imports.
Ah,
Assume so that's not that's the goal. Just like in the US, Fed is pushing interest rate up to make homes unaffordable for the majority. That's not the unintended consequences. That is the goal, to slow down economy, to create unemployment. Similarly, in Pakistan, State Bank is raising interest rate. They want to slow down economy. They want to make imports expensive so people demand less imports. But if when there are no domestic substitutes for imports, right? So we are just hoping that imports would decline. Of course, they will decline a little bit, but if they're essential, right, there will be a massive uh, spillover effect over all economy in terms of high inflation. So this floating currency exchange rate, and again, this leads to a lot of inflation in Pakistan. And this, uh, unless I think there's administrative measures are needed in the short run, such as limiting LCs, but a more sustainable solution is to a maybe remittances can improve, and also exports. And the most, and what I feel the government is counting on, or the state, is the foreign direct investments from the Gulf states. And that's the big bet they are making, that huge inflows would come in terms of agriculture, ports and minerals and all. You have heard all of that. That will ease off the pressure on dollar. That's the big bet. Other than that, I don't see any way out of this crisis in the short run.
and what do you think are going to be? I mean, I think it's going to have a serious political fallout. Because at the moment we have a caretaker government, we are heading towards a new election. The establishment is fully, in control of Pakistan's politics and everything. And I think this is going to put pressure on the establishment as well. I mean, and by that, for the viewers, those who may not know, Pakistan is a military establishment we're talking about. So what do you think Danish is going to, because obviously it is going to complicate that side of governance as well.
I mean, one thing it has exposed, I mean, past few weeks, that the whole discourse about politicians being unable to govern well, right? And we need a technocratic setup, right? Which assumes that technocrats can take really difficult economic steps and things would turn around great, right? While without, there's a famous, I mean, if you look at any reform process, the stability is key. You cannot just put a huge exogenous shock on the society which can disrupt the social fabric and assume that reforms would lead to any positive change. And that's what issue with the technocratic governments, because they seem to be less responsive, right, to electorate, and therefore uh, they have raised electricity rates at a more aggressive pace. Also, I think in
Fuel
terms of uh,
prices.
yeah, other food inflation, they seem to be less reluctant, right? So to control that, because they leave everything on market, and that has created that a major contradiction in the society, where now average working and middle classes beyond party lines, right, beyond party lines, they are more in the streets and want some sort of economic relief. So unless unless government provides a temporary relief to working and middle classes, the big plans of turning around economy through foreign direct investments would not bear much fruit, right? Because you must maintain minimum social stability in the system.
Right, minimum. So, well, I mean, I think it's a the next few weeks are going to be really tricky, especially there's the date of elections is expected. There are the changes taking place in Pakistan, but I think what we do need, Danish, is an alternative sort of plan for economic development, for economic stabilization, and that, unfortunately, I don't see it articulated enough or in a coherent manner. Of course, there are individual voices, I mean, such as yours or here or there, but there seems to be this gap in Pakistan's public discourse regarding what are the alternatives to IMF, what are the alternatives to neoliberal path dependency that we are kind of stuck in. And I think that is something that we really need to think about. But I want to, taking advantage of your time, how can we achieve at that particular point? I mean, how can we build that alternative solutions package, if I may say so? Because a lot of economists in Pakistan, or economists of Pakistani origin, even abroad, even in the US, they end up regurgitating the same neoliberal framework. So it's IMF light or IMF full calorie, or I or a diet IMF. I mean, so I often do not really see any fresh thinking there.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of emphasis on tax collection. So, right, you say, oh, because we're not paying taxes enough. All of this discourse, again, what I call an accounting framework, right? They just want a bigger amount in a kitty, right? So we can and spend less. I mean, fine. I mean, I think Pakistan might need to do that, but that's not the underlying issue, right? The underlying issue is your economic development is slow. It doesn't create enough employment for young people, and it does not produce goods and services which are demanded in the global marketplace. So you need to produce goods and services that rest of the world wants to buy from you, right? So that's the single goal that needs to be addressed, right? And then that requires a coordination among different stakeholders, including the business elites in Pakistan, state bureaucracy and judiciary, and again the representatives of the working class, the labor unions and trade unions, as some sort of a minimal agenda or minimal consensus, where we can agree that the focus will be on moving from these low productivity sectors of the economy to high productivity sectors of the economy, with a deal where the share of income of working and middle classes will increase, right? Otherwise, if we have seen this previously, the business elites are accumulating wealth at the expense of the working classes. And but this requires a massive coordination between these different stakeholders. And this is not possible unless there's some stakeholders who are willing to take a loss, right? And they are the winners right now. So that's where one would say that I am doing wishful thinking here, right? Assuming that those who are already winning, why would they cut a deal where they may have to uh, they'll gain in the long run, but in the short run they may lose, for instance, the real estate tycoons and so
Yeah.
on. And that's where I think It cannot be market driven alone. State needs to act as a facilitator to push towards that, and then market can lead to maybe efficient outcomes. But within the existing distribution of power and economic resources, market leads to inefficient outcomes in Pakistan, inefficient in terms of socio-environmental, and inefficient in terms of the output. And
Okay.
also,
Yes.
for instance, in terms of electricity, one medium to long term thing can be revisiting those IPP contracts, right? And again, it's because the environment has changed. So those, when those were signed earlier, that was different scenario. But again, they have been kosher. You cannot touch those contracts. Uh, so stuff like that needs to be brought back onto table.
Right, right. I think that's a very valid point. Danish, thank you so much for your time. And I hope we continue this conversation and maybe in the weeks and months to come up with some pointers by having more conversations so that at least we can sort of break or challenge this hegemonic understanding and view of Pakistan as a country and as an economic a machine or what we call the economy in
Yeah.
more technical terms. But thank you, viewers, for being
Thank
with
you.
us. Thank you, Danish.